Welcome to the Future Trends Forum. My name is Brian Alexander. I'm your host and cat herder for the next hour. I'm very glad to see so many people here today to talk about one of the most powerful, important issues facing higher education today. So if you haven't been here before, welcome. I'm going to introduce everything, make sure you see how it works. But first, let me just introduce the program and where it comes from. So, hello, the next slide, please. So you should know that the Future Trends Forum is a spin-off from the Future Trends in Technology and Education report. That's a monthly report that takes a look at present trend lines in technology and education. And it plays them against a battery of about 83 trends in order to look at where we think the future of education might be going. If you haven't seen it yet, just go to ftte.us. You can download a few sample copies and sign up. Now, we can also tell you that this is a discussion-oriented platform. And this is very, very important because this includes people from around the world. Now, if we're going to discuss the future of education and technology, we really need to have a global audience. Actually, here, next slide, please. Just to give you a sense of this, right now, the forum has been going on for a year and a half. And you can see from this map that we've had participants from almost every continent, from North America, South America, Europe, Central, East Asia, and Australia. And if you look at the little yellow tags, you can see that I've conducted this forum from 2 different continents, not to mention Iceland. It's vital to think about the future of education in a transnational sense. Now, we can only do this kind of discussion, we can only do this kind of work thanks to the support of several entities. I want to thank them now and invite you to join one. So to begin with, NYSERDAT in New York State, a nonprofit that helps network colleges, universities, as well as libraries and museums. They're very kind to us, and we're grateful to them for their support. We're also very grateful to Shindig because they provide 2 major sources of support. Obviously, they provide this technology, and I'm going to show you how this works in a second. But they also help us connect with wonderful people today, like May and Ella, who do a great job in producing every episode. Very grateful to them. So before we go further, let me just introduce you to the technology. Where I am right now, and where this slideshow is just for a minute, this is called the stage. This is where it's a kind of projection spot. And everybody who is here right now, everybody from George to Beverly, can hear and see everything up top. Now, our guest will be up here soon, and then you can join us if you have your camera and mic are working, and we can have a 3 or 4 way conversation up top. Now, below us is the audience space. I think of it as the participant swarm. And you can see all kinds of different people. They're either represented by a silhouette or by a video feed. So, for example, if you look at Melanie Maxim at UMass Lowell, there she is, probably startled that we're drawing attention to her. There's Scott Robeson with his headphones on at Portland State. You guys can wave if you like. So each of those boxes represents one login, and it could be one person or it could be a room. So like May, the Shindig, you can see behind her is a gentleman who is trying to hide, but I've now totally blown his cover. And people down there, as you'll see in this hour, those icons will move back and forth. They'll move and touch and change positions. If you would like to speak to somebody else in private, simply double-click on their icon. And if they want to talk to you, I mean, if they're not busy or if they don't hate you, and if their mic and technology work, then your 2 icons will click together like Lego pieces, and you'll have your own private audiovisual bubble for a conversation. And we'll be doing that actually in about half an hour. Now, this technology is built to facilitate discussion. So what we have now, with me pontificating in this slide, this is going to go away in a second. The idea here is to have as much conversation as possible. We actually have 4 different channels for you to do that. So let me just take you through 3 and then the 4th. So first of all, if you'd like to chat with us or chat with other people, look at the very bottom corner of the screen or bottom edge of the screen. There's a white tab and there's a few different icons on it. One of them is a raised hand. And if you click that, that'll tell us that you'd like to join us on stage. So if your mic and your camera are working and you're not in an incredibly public place, you can click that, and we'll bring you up on stage to join us. It's really easy to do. You'll be surprised how easy it is to do. Now, if you don't want to do that, but you do want to ask a question, so maybe your mic doesn't work or you're in a crowded office or whatever, click the little question mark box, and you can type in a question or a comment. And when the time is ready, we'll flash it on the screen, and I'll read it out loud. Now, the other thing you can do is there's a chat box, and you can see that's a kind of cartoon-like text chat box. If you click that, it'll pop up a chat box for you plus the nearest 18 or 17 people who would come into the room with you. And so you can have informal conversation. So right now in my room, we've already been complaining about the weather, which is either rainy or super hellacious. But we've already had a couple of good questions. Fred Bashir, for example, has an excellent question we're going to come to. So, 3 different ways within the Shindig environment. And if that's not enough, head over to Twitter. Because if you use the hashtag FTTE, just tweet there, and we'll be monitoring that during the session. And you can ask us questions. And I think you'll find the people who aren't in the Shindig session, say they're driving or they don't have enough bandwidth, they will ask questions and make comments there. So, long-winded way of saying we have many ways for you to converse and chat and ask questions. This is a social environment. Now, the third pillar of our support, beyond Shindig and beyond Ethernet, is you. We have people who support us on Patreon. So if you go to patreon.com/Brian Alexander, you can see people who have signed up to kick in even a little bit of support to keep all the lights on, to keep all the projects working. This is right now the only independent future of education project out there. And we need your support. So please go to patreon.com/Brian Alexander and contribute if you can. Now, next slide, please. Our guest this week is someone that I've been following for years, and I'm delighted to have him on board. In fact, I have a visual aid to brag about him. Chris Newfield is professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He's the author of a series of books, several of which are about higher education. In fact, he has coined the term critical university studies, and hopefully this is a field that's going to take off. The reason I wanted to have him here, besides the fact that he's awesome and has a terrific brain covering a lot of topics, is this current round of research where he's looking at what's happened to public higher education in the United States. So that's state-supported colleges and universities. I think he's done tremendous work. This book is one of the most important books in higher education for the past 10 years. I'm so glad to see him. Please welcome Professor Christopher Newfield, who's coming to us from London. Thank you so much for making time tonight. I really appreciate it.
No, it's really my pleasure.
I wanted to begin with asking you a couple of really basic questions, and then I want to dive into the book. I have a raft of questions. I've worn on a Post-it stack, I think 2 pens annotating this most recent book. But please, everybody else, don't let me hog this platform. There's a lot going on with this conversation, and I really want to hear from you. Just to begin with, can you tell us what you're working on this year? You have a new book that you're working on?
Yeah. It's actually connected to the previous book, the one that The Great Mistake. I'm working on the impact of quantification on the humanities and whether the shift to not just digital culture, but to things like interacting with your friends through Facebook likes is affecting the structure of knowledge, how we understand ourselves and how we understand other people. So I mean the book that about the university that we're here to discuss was motivated partly by my sense that as a society, as societies, we really need to be more intelligent than we are. That we can't operate anymore on the basis of the great educations given to a relatively small elite. Mm-hmm. That we need to spread, quality instruction in, intensiveness, immersion, education that's really about developing creative capabilities to everybody. Not the 2%, not really even the 20%, but to the whole society. And the public university was an experiment that really got going kind of right before World War II and developed in the United States after that by leaps and bounds. And it had all sorts of problems. I don't want to say that we need to go back to a golden age that didn't really exist. But the idea of relatively similar high quality for everybody, or what I think of as mass quality, was a kind of a floating, implicit, animating concept. And so I wrote the book because I think we need to redouble our efforts to have that. But there are a lot of policy obstacles and a lot of financial obstacles to doing that. So the book looks at the obstacles to getting to this place of kind of highly democratized, quasi-universal quality education, and then suggests at the end some ways that we can actually get there, undo the obstacles.
I hate to say it, but we need you to finish this book as soon as possible so we can bring you back.
That's the one you're holding in your...
Well, gosh, now I'm ahead of myself because that sounds incredibly important. I would love to hear your take on so many different pieces of that, from the digital humanities movement to where you see this playing out in the international scale to the different levels of higher education. But friends, just so you know, this is definitely someone whose books you need to have on your urgent list. Can I then bring this back to The Great Mistake? What kind of feedback have you gotten? What kind of responses have you gotten, especially from live audiences when you've spoken to people and presented?
I got one really bad review from a vice chancellor in England, and a lot of quite good ones. But actually, I'm kind of proud of that bad review. He thought that it was it was way too hard on university managers, and I think, I mean, there's one of the things that I try to emphasize in the book, and you never really know when you're writing something like this whether you've kind of hit the right balance or the right tone, is stress that the problem that universities are having now is a problem with the overall system and the way the pieces interact. So the book has a cycle structure called the devolutionary cycle, and it shows that the way that a decision over here, which makes sense at a particular time in a certain context, doesn't make sense at all when you see how you step back and see how it interacts with all the other decisions. So this guy, his name is Sir David Bell. He's the vice chancellor of the University of Reading, not that far from London. He personalized it in a way that I'm really hoping readers of the book, particularly in managerial positions, don't personalize it, because it's about a system. It's not about individual motivations, and it's not about individual intentions. I mean, people with the best intentions get caught in the financial incentive structure that I'm critiquing in the book, and they have a very difficult time getting out of it.
I think that's at least to this reader that comes clearly throughout the text. I mean, you do cite individual leaders, but I think you give them all, dare I say it, a fair and balanced shake. And it's clear that we're describing a historical process involving tens of millions of people, many decision makers.
Yeah, and it is really a global issue, as you were saying before.
I think so. Last month, I finally met an economist who thought that our cycle of debt for student loans, he thought that it was a good thing. I've been waiting to find this person for a long time. He's the first person I met who was happy about it. And in his view, he thought that we invented a very good model, and that other nations will soon be replicating it. But let me take a quick step back, if I could. One of the reasons The Great Mistake is such a powerful book for our time is that in the United States, depending on how you count this, roughly 65% of Americans who go through higher education go through public universities and colleges. It's our leading form. The private universities and colleges are a smaller sector. And what you what you investigate in great detail in this book is how over the past roughly 35 years, we've seen state investment in higher education drop steadily, year by year, state by state, decade by decade, political regime, political administration. It's been a steady downward curve. And you've identified this in the previous book, but what you've done here, again, forgive me if I get this wrong, is your devolutionary cycle. You break this down into a systematic purpose. It's not simply, say, malign state legislators. This is actually a multifaceted process. Could I ask you just to break that life cycle down a little bit and see, I think, 8 steps?
I'd love to. I'm obsessed with this thing. So for me, it starts with something that sounds a little bit abstract, but it was a implicit kind of collective move away from the idea that higher education is a public good and towards the idea that it's primarily a private good. In other words, we started to talk about college as something that was about getting a better salary. We downplayed more ambiguous, complicated, but I think much more important, finally, aspects of higher ed involving personal development, social development. We stopped talking about the non-market benefits to individuals, stopped talking about the indirect benefits. I have a chance at understanding things because my neighbors down the street understand them, and I run into them when I'm walking down the street, and they explain something to me because they had a good education. And we also stopped emphasizing the social benefits, what economists call the spillover effects of any particular, it's a set of activities that makes sort of everybody smarter collectively. So there's a lot in the book about how we backed away from that. I think it was economists didn't help us here, although some recent economics work that I rely on has been much more helpful in trying to get us to understand it. So what happened was most of the value, the total value of going to university became dark matter, and we stopped understanding it. We focused on the smaller piece of it, the private market value. And that is just the logic of that is that you will then ask people to pay personally out of their own pocket for something that is actually has most of its benefits going not back to them, but to the wider society. In other words, you're getting individual students and their families to, in effect, subsidize social benefits. So it's cheaper for the society and it's very onerous for the students, and this whole cycle gets going from there. So that's just the first step, and I'm happy to talk more about that. It's a bit abstract, but I think it's a question of unconscious, unsystematic philosophical choice that our society made that I think has fundamentally weakened it, and I'm very concerned about its long-term viability as a result of this decision. The second phase is then, because of the shift towards an interest in private sponsors, in particular and outside money, universities begin to overemphasize their relationship to outside sponsors. And the one thing I'm going to say about that, there's a lot of detail in the book about this, is that the university loses money on all these deals. It creates financial losses that have to be made up in other areas. So that's the second stage. And the third stage is then the production of tuition increases that are higher than consumer price index by sometimes by a factor of 2, sometimes by a factor of 4, year in, year out, for decades. And the claim in the book is that this does not simply come from state cuts, although that's important. It also comes from the fact that universities have built budgetary holes into their own budget model as a result of the shift, this privatization structure, the shift away from focusing on public good resources and public good activities and towards relationships with external sponsors. So that was the second step. The third is increasing tuition. The fourth step is public funding cuts. And the book argues that funding cuts from the state and tuition increases at private universities interact with each other. And that although we've been trained in recent years to think that it's the cuts from the state that force tuition increases, that is not actually the causality in any set of decades. Over a period of time, state legislators learn, they are taught by university leaders, that if they save money by cutting universities so they can spend money on tax cuts, or they can spend money on healthcare or something else, that it won't hurt universities because they can just go back to the students and raise fees. So there's a learning process over decades. And so the fourth stage of this devolutionary cycle is state funding cuts year in, year out, which is really the single most destructive cost or price of privatization. That once you move in the privatization direction, you convince your public funders, primarily state legislatures, that you don't really need them desperately to do for the state and for the state's young people what everybody wants universities to do for young people. Okay, so in other words, you can just charge them, and then you're going to load in financial aid, and everything is going to be fine. And the cuts that they're doing aren't really going to make that much difference. So when we get to that point, we are in a financially destabilized condition, and we've also weakened our claim on the public for support. We've weakened the public's sense of ownership over public universities. We've weakened the public's sense of responsibility for their quality, for the financial viability of the students that are going through, et cetera. So the fifth stage that comes from that is student debt, because the tuition increases produce that. And this is pretty straightforward, so I won't belabor it. But the one thing I want to throw in here that not everybody knows is that low-income students borrow as much as higher-income students. and their low attainment rates, that is in the bottom quartile and the fourth quartile, is one outcome of this, of the fact that it's an enormous financial hardship for lower income students to go. They are not protected from tuition, from the total cost of attendance structure that we have imposed on them. So we continue to have
lower income. Sorry.
Sorry?
So when you say the lower income students are borrowing as much, do you mean absolute terms or relative terms?
No, absolute terms. If you look at, just use California data, you look at national data, you see these bizarre flat bar charts in which students with family incomes between, say, $90,000 and $120,000 do not borrow the same amount as students who come from families that make less than $30,000 a year. And if you want to go into why that is, I'd be happy to regale you. But it's what it does is it takes the fig leaf over this whole system that made everybody feel like it was not so offensive. That we have a financial aid, we have high tuition, but yeah, we have high financial aid, and poor kids are being protected from high costs. The reality just rips that fig leaf away and says, look, the reality is that high-income students are finishing university at a much higher rate than low-income students, and there's a very simple reason why. We have not protected low-income students from debt. They have basically zero family resources to pay debt back with, in contrast to high-income students. So we're just this is the university taking a high tuition, high aid system and increasing inequality instead of reducing it, and fracturing the middle class instead of unifying it, and hurting the chances of low-income and working-class students to get into the middle class rather than improving their chances. And so this is where then the rest of the stages follow from this. Stage 6, private vendors come in to help universities save the money that they're now increasingly desperate to save, and end up taking core functions, particularly undergraduate instruction, away from the traditional sort of tenure track, stable departments with stable curricula, et cetera, and unbundle it in ways that, have some advantages, but that I think are net negative, which gets us to stage 7, which is growing inequality of educational attainment. The universities or colleges that are charged, that are basically open access, they're charged with taking more or less any student and trying to get them to a level of qualification that allows them to get a BA. They are doing that job with poorer students with fewer resources, and they have the lower graduation rates to show for it, which leads to the final stage, stage 8, which I call sort of post-middle class economics, in which you don't have, you're weakening your core constituency for public universities, which is, the enlarging middle class, the increasingly racially diverse middle class. And you're thereby damaging the willingness of the public to rebuild the whole structure. So that's the problem. And then in the last 40 pages of the books, I fixed the whole thing.
Well, we're going to come to that before we leave. Thank you for outlining this. If you haven't read the book, friends, the first 80% of it is working through this stage by stage in great detail. And one of the pleasures of it is just how many counterintuitive positions there are. Your answer to the Bennet hypothesis, for example, was really striking. But before I ask questions, we have a stack of them. Nori, you were going to run short on time, so I'll make sure that you get your question in. So please either click the raised hand or the question mark or type it in the chat box. Ella, there was a text question that came in. Why don't you put that up? This is from the awesome Roxanne Riskin, and she asks, "What is the mistake?" as mentioned by the awesome title. And is it the divestment? Is it the devolutionary cycle? Is that the mistake?
It's privatization. It's treating a public good as though it were a private good. It's a fundamental economic policy mistake. And then so that whole cycle that I just belabored follows from that.
Good question, Roxanne. And
thank you.
That makes absolute sense. We haven't used the word neoliberalism yet. I'll come back to that if we can. We have a question from the awesome Fred Bashirs. Let me just read this out. He says, I worked at UC Berkeley, 1987 to 2007, as an educational technologist. For most of this time, I worked with their instructional technology program. My question for our guest is whether he has given thought to the British Open University. In particular, I'd like to know if he would support the development of a U.S. Open University, patterned after the British, but with one twist. It would be part of a free tuition program funded by the U.S. government. And he reminds us that the UKOU was created by a Labour government. Thanks, Fred.
Yeah, that's the Open University was a fantastic example of a public good resource. It was very low cost in the beginning. It's not anymore. It produced really high quality materials. It's a perfect example of this thing that I'm fixated on, which is mass quality. In other words, giving people from low income communities, giving people of color, giving people from immigrant families the same level of quality as the folks are getting at Oxford and Cambridge. And in fact, in the 60s and the 70s, OU produced absolute classic textbooks, think materials that are still being used in different fields and that were built on over decades collaboratively with lots of input from students. So it's just, it lost a little bit of its steam because some of the people that had been shut out of higher education access who were using it were increasingly able to go as the physical system expanded in the 80s and 90s. But I think that it's parts of it are still going strong in places like Scotland, places where they're trying to overcome physical distance or disability or other issues where people, for various reasons, can't actually get to a physical campus. And distance learning and ed tech is fantastic for that. The problem is you cannot increase the use of something where you want to maximize the use of it, like education, by charging a price that is going to shut out a whole bunch of people. When you're charging £100 a year, maybe you're only shutting out 1% of the folks that want to use it. When you're charging £9,000 a year, which is basically what everybody's charging now in the United Kingdom, it's going up a little bit next year, you're shutting out maybe half, maybe 2/3. I mean, nobody really knows because they also have a system of financial aid that fudges that. So if OU were rolled back to free, and if it were publicly subsidized, I think it could actually revive the original mission that it had, which is taking a diverse population with very different educational backgrounds, social positions, religious orientations, et cetera, and bring them into the society at the top educationally and not at the bottom of second or third or fourth tier. And what I'm concerned about now is that the implicit, unspoken policy outcome of charging as though education were a private good is exactly that stratification, which you got the 2 or the 3% going to Ivy League type schools, and then you got people going to public flagships, and they're doing pretty well. The 20%'s not anything we have to worry about. The 80% we do have to worry about. They're getting underserved, and I don't mean to get environmental about this, but I don't see how the society is viable if we try to solve our enormous problems with this tiny elite that's often just out of touch with everybody.
Oh, well, that's
sorry about the rant.
No, that's
part of my motivation for this.
We'll come back to that. Fred, welcome. That was a great question. Do you want to chime in and follow that up?
Well, one of the reasons I added the twist of making it a part of a tuition-free public education movement would be to address the problem that you raised about the British Open University. And that is the British Open University is in a position where they have to charge tuition for attending their courses. And one of the things that got me started on this way back in 2005, I was looking at the high cost of textbooks. And I testified before a congressional committee on what we could do to create open educational resources to compete with the commercial textbook industry. And the proposal I raised back in 2005 was to form a large coalition of schools or to have direct public funding to buy out the British Open University, to put their content in the public domain, and then use that as either free courses or free course materials that could be turned into distance education courses or free textbooks, right? But I got very little support for this from the left, and because for the most part, the left associates, I think, distance education with neoliberalism. And that's why I like to point out that the British Open University was started by a Labour government.
Yeah.
So
no, you're right.
But
and it was really it was an emancipator for a lot of people.
Yeah.
I'd be interested in buying out academic publishers, getting a consortium together for that. Because I mean, my personal feeling as a professor about the cost of textbooks is that I have no control over it. And in fact, those academic publishers are damaging the budget of my own institution and my own libraries. I mean, where we can't even afford to buy some of the journals that we need because of the monopoly pricing of those things. Did you look at that at all? Not just public domain, but actually buying the publishers themselves through some kind of public entity.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but you're talking about not textbooks necessarily. You're talking about academic publications, Elsevier, and things like that.
Yeah,
so
journals.
At Berkeley,
both.
Yeah, at Berkeley, the go-to guy at Berkeley for that is Cliff Lynch. So if you want to talk about open journals, talk to Cliff Lynch. My look at, and I worked with these open educational resource forums, and the sense that I got is they really wanted a bottom-up approach where professors working in what I call Lone Ranger mode would develop these resources and then put them in the public domain, which is great. That's the traditional way. But if you look at how the British Open University creates their content, it's very different than the Lone Ranger approach. It's a professional development team. And they'll spend a lot of money to develop their content. It's very high quality content, as you were saying. But they don't mess around. It's, they pay people good money to write the books and to be the subject matter experts and to work on the software and all that. It's sort of like creating a documentary. But I got very little support for that sort of top-down approach from the left because they associate that sort of top-down approach with a professional development team. They associate that with neoliberalism. Also,
I'm hoping that if we can come up with a different economic or funding model, we won't have those same associations or the same problems.
Well, if I could, Fred, I wanted to use that to bounce off of a question that I think is really important that comes up repeatedly in your book. Why is this evolutionary cycle, Chris, a bipartisan one? How come this hasn't been? I mean, if you think about at least the placards that advertise both political parties in the U.S., you'd think that this would be a red state Republican drive, and the Democrats and blue states would fight heroically against it. But you make a case repeatedly that this is bipartisan. How did that happen?
Yeah, I think that Democrats became convinced after Reagan and through the power of the Clinton sort of third way and Blairism in the United Kingdom that they had to play market ball. They weren't going to be in the conversation if they didn't accept fundamental ground rules around the incentives that private goods and market forces provide. So I think most Democrats, Charles Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, people that are really important on the policy thing, they want the outcomes to be better. They want society to be fair and more egalitarian, and they want there to be less, racism and less violence and discrimination, and they want more equitable development. But if your starting point is that the tools to get there are unevenly distributed because they're allocated by price, something that's a public good, then you're going to never fix your inequality problem. And I think that's where we are. It's just that Democrats cannot get to the public good state. And I'm hoping, I'm not a policy person, and I'm an English professor with a weirdly interdisciplinary background, but I would really like this book to be a, part of a conversation, or help inspire a broader conversation about converting pipelined, rationed goods, rationed by market forces, into things that are freely accessible. Healthcare. We understand this with kindergarten. We're starting to understand it with preschool. You cannot charge parents $1,200 a month for preschool and expect every kid to start school at the same place. It's insane. We're hamstringing, a huge percentage of our population because of our childcare system, at the 0 through 5 stage. We understood this about primary school in the 19th century. We understood it about secondary school in the late 19th and early 20th century. It had to be free, or you're going to lose tons of people. We understood it about university after World War II with veterans, et cetera. What's wrong? What's wrong with us now? I don't think this is really, Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel.
It's not that complex. Thank you, Fred. By the way, that was a terrific follow-up question, and I think this sketches out some possible directions that we can go in.
Yeah, me too.
We have more questions coming in. There's one from Scott Robeson, who asks, or he says, one of the most enlightening concepts that I was familiar with but didn't fully understand until reading The Great Mistake was around the concept of the privatization of higher ed. Besides privatization through increasing tuition and reduced state and federal funding, can you summarize what privatization means and through some of the various hidden ways higher ed is being privatized, e.g. outsourcing ed tech tools? I think you've hit some of this already. Do you want to zero in on a few more?
Yeah, privatization is the summary one sentence of it is treating a public good as a private good. So, in other words, structuring it by price. But most people think it means you're selling the university off to a private company. That's not really how it works. The way that the hidden version of it is probably the single most important one. Has to do with forced subsidies from the university as the cost of participating in partnerships with outside entities.
Right.
Some of these it's a pay-to-play system, to be one way of putting it. Research sponsors are the most important of these. So this is a problem with public entities also, with the federal and state governments. They're not innocent here at all. What happens is they pay direct costs on grants, then they give some money to pay for overhead for facilities and administration, as it's called. But it's never enough to cover the full cost of the research, both the direct and the indirect costs. And so universities have to use a lot of their own money to make the research operation whole. The average in the United States is 19 cents on the dollar. So for every dollar of money that's spent on research, 19 cents of it comes from the university's own pocket. And in public universities, that means either from the state or from student tuition. At private universities, it means endowment and student tuition. They have some other sources, but those are the main ones. So this is that when you move to private companies who don't sponsor that much total R&D, right? It's really only about 5 or 6%. They are giving overhead or indirect cost money at 2%, rather than say in the 50s or 60% of the direct costs. Some foundations have written into their charters that they will pay zero overhead. One of them is the Legacy Foundation, which funds tobacco research, which is a good thing. But they're forcing the university to subsidize all of their indirect costs as the price of getting the grant. The Gates Foundation, which has, as you know, most of the money in the United States, well, at least quite a bit. It's probably the single most important foundation in America right now. Let's put it that way. Yeah. It allows a maximum of 10% instead of, I think the actual cost is around 70% of indirect on top of direct. Anyway, that's getting a bit in the weeds. The point is that then the entity on the outside of the university, whether it's private or public, is able to get a subsidy for activities that it is benefiting from at the other end. So that's I think that's the one that we're least interested in talking about within the university, but it's I think the most important for the public to understand better. Why does college cost so much? Well, at research universities, it's because we're losing money on our extramural research, and we have to find money inside in order to make it possible.
And there's that hidden cost. Scott, that's a great question. And Chris, this is especially true for the sciences and STEM fields, right? Because their grant funding.
Yeah.
Well, we can connect to
social sciences and arts have very poorly funded research that doesn't really cost the university much of anything. So we're not really in that picture at all.
We had a couple more questions. Ella, why don't you bring up one of the test questions? We've had people waiting very patiently because this is clearly striking a lot. From Dave Thomas out in Denver. How do faculty fit into this? Do faculty have responsibility in the great mistake?
That's another really good question. The answer is yes. They have
yes.
responsibility. There's two big ways. One is they have actively militated for research losses because it helps them do their research. And really, until STEM faculty say, okay, we recognize that this funding system is unsustainable, and we want to fix it, the thing is really not going to get fixed. I mean, there's just too much power, too much importance around STEM research, too much social prestige. Faculty really have to step up and fix that. Another area where faculty have been, I don't know, at best naive, is around fundraising. You know, fundraising can fund very specific projects very well, and they make some things possible that would never happen otherwise. So I'm not knocking these projects as such. I am knocking the model of fundraising as somehow replacing public funding. It doesn't. It's much smaller, and it never goes to general operations of the kind that produce general learning, widespread enlightenment, in the old-fashioned sense. Synergies among different kinds of students at different levels, undergraduates, grads, postdocs, faculty. It creates a community of learning that we always wax poetic about. It doesn't sponsor that. It doesn't pay for undergraduate fee reduction. There's a few targeted fellowships or scholarships, but generally speaking, it doesn't replace. And faculty have not said, damn, we got to get our public funding back because fundraising and research income is not going to replace it. So there, I think we've been remiss, and that really gets me to the second big way, which is that in the last 10 years, I think faculty have taken a step back from trying to fix our own institutions. And instead, there's a lot of cynical reason out there. We can't really do anything about it. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Academic sense have been cut out of the loop, or 75% of student credit hours are now being offered by contingent faculty. So we don't have any power in the institution anyway. That kind of thinking has been very destructive. People have retreated into their own deals and their own activities. I understand why. I'm not judging, but it's just we can't continue to do that, because that means that other factors are more influential than tenure-track faculty are in setting policy. And it's natural for, the university to move in a different direction, a corporate direction or neoliberal direction, or something that's not really about undergraduate or graduate students or about research in the deep sense, if the people that do research and learning and teaching in the deep sense are not at the table. So yeah, we've been demobilized, self-demobilized, and that has to change.
It's almost we've abdicated and demobilized.
Yeah,
this is huge, and I think in many ways this book seems to grow in its reach and import the more we talk about this. Before I follow up, Ella, there's at least two more questions that you wanted to share. And this is from the awesome Gardner Campbell, who is not just a friend of the forum, but a guest. I hear Christopher say personal development is a public good. Can he unpack that more? What kind of development does it include? Intellectual development in the humanities beyond critical thinking?
Yeah, it's another really good question. What do we mean by personal development beyond critical thinking? I think it means positive, constructive, and creative capabilities. Problem analysis and then problem solving. I think it means being able to interpret, it's a core humanities activity, interpret ambiguous information under conditions of uncertainty. It means being able to live without an algorithm that's, a kind of a program or a script that will generate an answer under certain conditions. Because you don't have a script. You haven't done the programming. It's novel. I think it means students being able to identify complex problems, complex causality, and then doing this when they go on to be adults as well. It's not just when they're in university by any means. And then being able to construct projects that have many steps that will allow them to make progress on solving the problem over time. In other words, not only being able to work without bosses, which is very important, especially with creative work, but being able to sustain creative practice with adversity, with duration, with interruption, with skepticism, even contempt. Having that, this kind of 19th century. My first book is on Emerson, and I'm about to betray that. What we used to call character. This kind of ensemble of abilities that allow people to imagine themselves and imagine their society. And just one quick thing about the first part of your question. Why is that more than a private good? And the answer is because it's these complex and difficult to talk about forms of know-how are the things that have the undirected consequences that benefit others. They go into democratic capabilities and ability. How do you get to the point where you can go to a town hall that your congressperson is holding about Trump care and not just shout, but try to understand where everybody's positions are, try to understand what the congressperson is saying to you, try to, on the fly, take the question you had coming in, revise it, make it better, work with a group or propose a project that would enlighten the congressperson who is clearly not understanding what the position of the people in the room is, et cetera. I mean, that's something on which democracy is predicated, and yet it's not clear to me that we're producing a really high percentage of people that are comfortable with that. They can do it more or less automatically. So there's a lot of other ways of talking about how this personal development pleasure, God, I love reading George Eliot and other novels kind of experience becomes a public good that benefits the society as a whole.
What a fantastic answer. A great question. I'm delighted to connect you two, Gardner and Chris. That makes public good into a much richer sense than it might be, at least in public discourse. Tom, welcome Tom Haynes. Tom, are you in Houston right now?
Yeah, I'm in Houston. I just have a real quick question, which probably will merit a long answer, but I wanted to know how you saw the role of community colleges fitting into this picture, because half of the students in this country go to community college who are attending higher ed, and I'll just leave you with that and sign off.
Yeah, I know you all are really on a roll. That's another great question. It needs to be much better funded and taken seriously, not as tech school.
Mm-hmm.
So my short answer is that it's being seen as a way of doing training of kind of mid-level or lower to mid-level workers that you don't have to pay as much as you might have had to pay them 20 years ago. And that I think a certain kind of business leader has been telling politicians like Barack Obama is the missing link in our manufacturing and kind of sophisticated services economy. In other words, not trying to produce people that can, build and repair robots that are going to take their jobs. We're just trying to find people that can operate machines that operate robots, or like with a one person. And I think that that's really a mistake. I think that lower income people that need a second chance or a third chance or a fourth chance at university, or need community colleges to get them into competition at the upper middle, at the very least, or at the top in terms of cognitive capabilities. I'm just concerned that they're getting slotted into this. Okay, well, it's basically grade 13 and 14. So our high schools, the thinking is partly our high schools aren't really doing the job anymore, so now we need to have 2 more years of high school. And that is really the wrong approach. But it's cheap, and it kind of it convinces the proverbial working class, or at least pieces of it, that we're trying to do something for them. And now that I've said that, I want to take it back, because I think that nobody that actually goes to these schools believes that. I think it's really part of the political structure that is kind of sending that message out in spite of people's actual experience. I mean, one last thing I would say is we stress the pipeline 4-year from 2-year in California. And I've been having transfers from community college students in my courses for 25 years. And they are at least as good as the students that started out, even though some of them were not able to get into UC Santa Barbara the first time that they applied and ended up in community college for that reason. And that just convinces, it's kind of my, my democratic instincts about education in general. It just convinces me that what the job is to get them into the higher position, even if that means spending a lot more money and de-adjunctifying, something we haven't really talked about today, their staff, and means biting the bullet and saying, here's the educational quality that we want, and then working backwards to saying, and here's the budgeting that we need in order to make that happen.
What a rich
Thank
answer. And thank you, Tom. I'm sure George Station, Michael Berman, and the other Californians in the crew would want to join you in your celebration of that round. I'm conscious of time, and we only have about 7 minutes left, and we have 3 more questions to go. There's one from Sophia. If we bring Sophia Lederman, what do you think of the steady increases in state funding over the last 4 years? Does this have implications for the trend toward privatization of higher education? Namely, does it signal a reversal? Good question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yes and no. It signifies to me guilt. They feel badly because they know they've overcut. They've really overcut, and they know that they've screwed their rising generation with this insane amount of debt that nobody that's making decisions could ever have imagined having when they were in university. So there's the thing I think to bear in mind, though, is that we're still not back where we were in terms of overall state funding we were in 2008. There's been partial recovery, but if you correct, I know the California case better, but I've looked somewhat at the national data recently. If you correct for enrollment growth and inflation, the per student funding is still below where it was basically a decade ago. So it's kind of like a lost decade situation. And so I think we're on a better path, but we need to push much harder going in that direction. And I guess, the larger thing I would say about this is I do think the pendulum around university has completely swung from this private good Reagan Clintonism, where they really agreed on the need to everybody to have skin in the game and shell out their own money and take on debt and see it as an investment, back to something closer to a Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders position, homage to Vermont there, intended, where free college, which is a fringe idea in 2013. My colleague at UCSB, Bob Samuels, wrote a book called Why College Should Be Free. Everyone, he said I was a lone crazy voice in the wilderness. 3 years later, that becomes the Democratic national platform for the presidential campaign. So even though we're stumbling and we're focused on Trump and we're focused on much more alarming problems right now, I think as things settle down and as we approach the 2018 midterm elections, that's going to be back on the table, and that we're really in a much healthier situation than we were even 3 years ago for thinking about university as a public good for the benefit of everyone.
Thank you very much, Sophia, for the question, because that really maybe, looking ahead a bit, what do you think the odds are, Chris, of actually seeing states continue to follow this up? I'm sorry. What do you think the odds are? Yeah, do you think states are going to continue this curve upward? Do you think they're going to try to live out that guilt and try and fund upward again?
I think it's going to actually take a federal solution, because the states are dealing with healthcare costs that they've never imagined. You know, that, I mean, I have another colleague at UCLA who starts his talks about California with the question, well, so when the university was free in the mid-'60s at University of California, what was the state expenditure for Medicare and Medicaid, or Medi-Cal as we call it?
Yeah.
And only a few people in the room know that the correct answer is zero. There's just no competing cost for healthcare. So it's going to require a national solution, you know, especially given the Republican, you know, almost 2-to-1 majority control of state governments nationally, and their reluctance to build up a sector that they think is kind of hostile to them, and so on. We haven't even talked about the culture wars issue, which is not helping either.
Well, there's a reason why you have a 400-page book that's crammed at every page with information. I mean, this is I think in some ways this is like an Oswald Spengler take on higher education.
Not quite sure what that means.
Well, that's a compliment. It's a compliment in this case. But let me. I'm again conscious of time, and forum stalwart George Station had a great question I wanted to bring up. This is a very practical one. Is there an audiobook version on the way?
I wish. Write to Audible.
Well, maybe.
Yeah, it's a great idea. I haven't heard anything about that though.
Well, there are a few other ways of doing this. I mean, one is Audible, but also you can crowdsource this. You can just ask people to take turns reading chunks of it, and there are people who've done this. And if you have the time, let's say you're on the plane from London to California, right? Put a blanket over your head and read out loud. I'd be the first to volunteer to read one of the chapters.
That's really nice of you. I'll run that by my publisher.
Well, Greg, Greg's right here. I have one last question, if we have time. Do we have time? Is it not too late for you?
No, I'm fine.
Okay, this is a fascinating one from Nori Barajas Murphy. I'm just going to read this because I think there's actually two questions crammed in this. She says, I observe the spa-fication of private colleges and the impact on tuition. Does that give us insight into the need for pools / gyms / LEED buildings? And LEED is the environmentally certified standard of buildings.
Yeah. So that's a really important issue also. So what we have to do is separate improvements in facilities and staffing that add cognitive gain from increases in facilities and staffing that are just the cost of competition with other places. And we can't do that until we have an open public discussion about what really matters to students in learning and what doesn't, and what really matters to research. So, I mean, a lot of that, I mean, I have to say, I'm a critic of these kinds of capital projects in general, but some of them really are part of increasing the quality of care. So, for example, dorms that are wired properly and that have meeting spaces and that allow students to congregate not just for parties but also for studying and so on, probably do help certain kinds of students. Increased student staffing, dealing with stress, with mental illness issues of various kinds, with identity issues of the kind that are really important to traditional university-age students, dealing with sexuality and transgender identity issues. Having professional people that can do this well really does help people graduate at a high level of performance or of learning. So that has to be pulled out, and we're so shut down and just talking about stuff and airing our issues and getting input from students and parents and the general public and student staff people and so on, that we can't figure this out. We're stymied. And so a lot of if there's one sentence summary of my book is like, can we talk? I just want to do that. As you can tell. Sorry.
But I'm so glad that you spoke through this book and its predecessor. And I'm so glad that you took the time to speak with us now. I really hate to wrap things up. Talking past the hour. Thank you so much. Please, I know this is superfluous, but enjoy London for us.
Thank you. Thank you. And all of you, please be in touch with me if I can respond to other questions or help in any way. Or if
What's the best way?
You want to steer me back on the path of brightness. What's
the best way to find you? Should we do it through your blog or?
The blog the blog is it's called University, and then you can also find me in the English department at UC Santa Barbara.
Excellent, and we'll share that.
All right, thanks again, everybody. I really enjoyed it a lot.
Okay, well, take care. I have to wrap up for a bunch of next week, and let me just mention. Let me ask you guys just to look back over the previous hour. Think about what we saw and experienced. We had somebody from a third of the world around the way speaking to us from deep research, deep passion, and a lot of advanced thinking. And in response, you all responded to him through questions and comments, through video, through text, through email. And what we had just now is an hour-long intensive seminar on the fate of higher education. I think you should all feel great about that. After all, that's how we roll in the Future Transform. Next week, we shift ground into pedagogy and computer-based learning, and we have a wonderful guest, Professor Mark Carnes from Barnard and Columbia University. He's the founder and one of the leaders of the Reacting to the Past game. So this is a game where students get to simulate historical decisions. It's a rich, fantastic game. People really need to know about it. I'm so privileged that we'll be able to have him here and a chance to dive into that. So that's for next week. But there's more. So in case you don't have enough reading, we also are going to be finishing a current reading for a book club. This is Werner Winn's Rainbow's End. So we've already read 2/3 of the book, and we're coming to the conclusion right now. And so far, this conclusion involves everything from what happens to mobile devices and social media to impact learning, what happens when we have Google scanning books, what happens when this ties into all kinds of developments about geopolitics. It's an exciting book. Please grab a copy and catch up with us. And if you're already reading it, I want to hear what you think about Rabbit by the end. But there's another book to know about, because this week, hitting the shelves of bookstores everywhere books are sold, is my latest book. So the new digital storytelling. This is actually an updated and revised version of my 2011 book. This is about how to tell stories with digital media, everything from gaming to virtual reality, social media, mobile devices. So if you haven't had a chance to buy it, please take a look at it. Tell your library to have it. Grab a copy for your kids. In the meantime, thank you all so much for being here. We have a lot more to talk about. If you want to learn more about what we talk about, go to ftte.us, or learn about this great technology, look at shindig.com. Again, thank you all. See you next week.